It was the kind of night that crept into your bones, wind howling through the trees, snow falling like whispers from the sky. In a quiet cabin nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, Mary Callahan thought she was alone. But then, scratch, scratch, a faint noise at the door. Expecting a stray dog or perhaps nothing at all, she opened it, and froze. There, shivering in the cold, was a tiny wild creature. Not a kitten. Not a raccoon. A baby wildcat, eyes wide and pleading. What happened next would rewrite everything Mary thought she knew about the wild. The snowy night that changed everything. The wind screamed through the tall pines like a warning song from the mountains. Snow coated every branch and trail in thick layers, burying the world under a heavy silence. It was the kind of night when even wild animals hunkered down, and humans prayed their power stayed on. In a cabin at the edge of the Blue Ridge National Forest, 42-year-old Mary Callahan stirred a pot of soup, her golden retriever Jasper snoring softly by the fire. The glow of the hearth flickered against the rustic wooden walls, dancing over canvases, brushes, and half-finished paintings that lined every corner. Mary lived alone, but not unhappily. Since losing her husband to cancer 5 years earlier, she had carved out a quiet life in the North Carolina wilderness. She was an artist and a part-time wildlife photographer, someone who found beauty in details others often missed: the shimmer of frost on leaves, the moment a deer turned its head in stillness, the color of a raven's wing. Tall and slender, with a curtain of auburn hair always half-tucked behind her ears, Mary had the look of someone both gentle and strong. The local townsfolk saw her as that mountain painter lady, soft-spoken, friendly, but private. She had grown to love her isolation. Jasper was her only companion now, an aging but loyal retriever with fur the color of wheat and a nose always pressed to her side. Her life followed a quiet rhythm. She painted in the mornings, hiked in the afternoons, and at night, curled up with old books and tea while the wind howled outside. It was a peaceful, almost sacred routine. But on this particular evening, something felt different. As she sat at her easel touching up the feathers of a red-tailed hawk in her latest painting, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin walls harder than usual. Then came the scratching. At first, it was so soft she thought she imagined it. Then, scratch, scratch, again. Mary turned, her brow furrowed. Jasper's ears perked, his head lifting. She stood, heart rate picking up, and walked cautiously to the front door. She wasn't afraid, at least not yet. Out here, it wasn't uncommon for a possum or raccoon to come nosing around on stormy nights. Still, she hesitated. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then came one final thump, barely audible over the wind. Mary slowly unlatched the door and pulled it open. The wind rushed in, and with it, something she never expected. The wind slammed into her like a wave of ice, stealing her breath. Mary squinted into the snowy night. At first, she saw nothing, just the swirl of flakes under the porch light. Then, movement. A small figure, trembling on the wooden steps. She leaned forward. It wasn't a raccoon. Not a stray dog either. It was tiny, barely the size of a large kitten, with mottled gray fur speckled with black rosettes and short but muscular legs. Its ears were large and pointed, each with a tiny black tuft on top. Its eyes, icy blue and wide with fear, locked onto hers. Her breath caught. It was a wildcat. A bobcat kitten, no more than 7 or 8 weeks old. Too young to be alone. Too cold to survive this storm. Mary stood frozen in the doorway, one hand gripping the knob. The kitten wavered, its front paw lifted slightly as if it hurt to stand. Its sides trembled with shallow breaths. It made no sound. Just stared. Behind her, Jasper approached the door with a soft whine. The dog's calm presence broke her paralysis. Most dogs would bark. Growl. React. But Jasper merely sat, his tail gently tapping the floor, curious, not alarmed. Mary stepped onto the porch slowly, crouching down. She didn't move too close. "Hey there, little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The kitten flinched, but didn't run. It was too exhausted. Mary noticed its paws were raw, tiny pads crusted with frozen mud. Its thin coat clung wetly to its sides. Something had driven it here, something desperate. A lost mother? An injury? Abandonment? The wild rarely brought its young this close to human life without a reason. Mary hesitated only a moment longer. Then she took off her scarf, gently wrapped it around the tiny creature, and lifted it into her arms. It didn't struggle. It didn't even mew. It just shivered and collapsed against her chest. Inside the cabin, she placed it on a thick towel beside the fireplace. Jasper lay nearby, watching silently. Mary filled a shallow dish with goat milk and placed it beside the kitten. To her relief, it stirred, sniffed, and began to drink, tiny tongue flicking rapidly. She crouched beside it, her heart racing. "Where did you come from?" she whispered. She could already tell this was no ordinary rescue. Something about the kitten, its silence, its eyes, the way Jasper had welcomed it without hesitation, made her chest ache. She touched its damp fur gently, brushing away a leaf stuck behind one ear. The kitten paused, then pressed its head slightly into her hand. That was the moment it happened. That quiet, electric shift. Not just pity. Not just instinct. A bond. Something ancient and unexplainable had been born by that fire on a snowy night. Mary didn't know it yet, but her life, her quiet, solitary life, had just ended. And something much wilder had begun. A wild soul at the door. The next morning arrived slowly, wrapped in silence and heavy snow. The world outside Mary's cabin was blanketed in white, but inside, warmth crackled from the fireplace and a quiet miracle slept curled in a nest of fleece blankets. The baby Wildcat, still unnamed, lay on her side, her breathing now steadier. Mary had checked her tiny body the night before, bruised pads, slightly underweight, no broken bones. She suspected the kitten had been without its mother for at least 2 nights, possibly more. Still, the fact she was alive at all was astonishing. Jasper had slept beside her the whole night, occasionally nudging her with his nose, as if reassuring himself she was still breathing. Mary sat cross-legged on the floor, a sketchpad resting on her knees, trying to capture the outline of the kitten's ears and the sharp angles of her little face. It was instinctive, this need to preserve the moment. But in the back of her mind, worry had begun to bloom. She knew the laws. In North Carolina, keeping a wild animal without a permit, even a young one, was illegal. And while her isolated cabin might have kept this encounter quiet for now, word had a way of traveling fast in small towns. Especially about the woman who lives alone with a dog and paints birds. But Mary couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a typical encounter. This was something more. The kitten stirred, stretched her legs, and yawned. Then, to Mary's amazement, she did something unexpected. She got up on shaky legs, walked toward Jasper, and curled up beside him. Jasper didn't move. He simply let her tuck herself into his warm fur, as if she had always belonged there. Mary's heart squeezed. She smiled, finally saying aloud the name that had been floating in her mind all morning. "Ash," she whispered. "That's what I'll call you." It felt right. Ash, like the color of her fur. Like the ashes of the fire she was now rising from. A survivor. After breakfast, Mary made the first call, to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. It was the responsible thing to do. But as the phone rang, her stomach twisted. A woman named Lisa answered, her voice kind but firm. Mary explained everything, the storm, the scratching, the condition of the kitten. She left out only one detail, that she had already formed a bond. "I understand you mean well," Lisa said. "But bobcats aren't pets. They can't be domesticated. We have protocols." Mary bit her lip. "I understand. But, what if she's different?" Lisa paused, clearly used to this argument. "They're all different at first. They imprint easily when they're this young. But when she grows teeth, gets wild instincts." "She already has teeth," Mary said gently. "She hasn't once hissed or clawed. She sleeps next to my retriever." Silence. Lisa sighed. "Look, I can file the intake form. We'll need to get her in within 48 hours. Mary agreed, but hung up slowly. Across the room, Ash opened her eyes. And Mary knew, deep in her bones, this wasn't going to be easy. She walked to the window, looking out over the snow-covered woods. Somewhere out there, this kitten had come from heartbreak, hunger, or worse. And now fate had left her here. But for how long? Mary had no idea. All she knew was this: two creatures had found each other in the cold. And neither one wanted to let go. The following day, Mary drove into town with Ash nestled inside a carrier lined with fleece and straw. She had scheduled an appointment with the local vet, Dr. Callie Hargrove, who'd treated Jasper for years. If anyone could help assess Ash without panic or judgment, it was Callie. Snow still dusted the roads, and Mary felt every bump like a jolt to her nerves. As she parked behind the clinic, she peeked into the carrier. Ash was awake now, eyes sharp and curious, but calm. She made no sound, just observed. That silence was unsettling and beautiful at once. Inside the exam room, Callie leaned over the carrier, lifting an eyebrow. "This is not a kitten," she said, crouching down to peer in. Mary nodded. "She showed up at my door during the storm. Alone. Cold. I couldn't leave her." Callie glanced up, her expression unreadable. "She's young. Very young. You probably saved her life." She examined Ash carefully, temperature, eyes, paws. "She's dehydrated. Some bruising, frostbite on 2 paw pads. But otherwise, lucky." Mary exhaled. "She's eating well. Follows me around the house. Sleeps beside Jasper." Callie paused, then asked the question Mary had been dreading. "Have you called Wildlife Services?" Mary hesitated. "I called the Blue Ridge Center. They want her brought in within 48 hours. Callie sighed, removing her gloves. "You know the rules. They won't allow private keeping of bobcats. They'll rehab her, then release her. Best case scenario." "And worst case?" Mary asked. Callie met her eyes. "She's already bonded. They might consider her imprinted, too familiar with humans to survive in the wild. That puts her in a gray zone." Mary's heart clenched. "I think she's different." "Mary," Callie said gently, "I believe you. But the law doesn't care about instincts. It's about species." That night, back at the cabin, Mary stared at the flickering fire while Ash curled up in a tight ball beside Jasper. They looked like a storybook painting. A golden retriever and a bobcat, side by side, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe, in some hidden language between animals, it was. But humans didn't see it that way. By morning, the gossip had already begun. At the general store, a man Mary barely knew whispered to another customer, "She's got a wildcat in there. I saw it jump in her truck." By noon, a rumor had reached her neighbor, Evelyn Finch, who was known for calling the sheriff over everything from coyotes to suspicious deer. Evelyn knocked on Mary's door that evening, a smile too wide to be friendly. "Everything all right up here?" she asked, peering behind Mary's shoulder. Mary kept her face calm. "Fine, Evelyn. Just a little wildlife encounter during the storm." Evelyn leaned forward, whispering, "You know, word gets around. I'd hate for someone to call animal control by mistake." Mary closed the door slowly in response. But her hands were shaking. She called the wildlife center again that night. Spoke to Lisa a second time. "Has anyone reported it?" Mary asked directly. Lisa paused. "Not yet. But if someone does, we'll have to act fast. You could be fined. Or worse." "And what happens to her?" "If she's deemed unreleasable, she could be transferred to a sanctuary, or euthanized, if resources aren't available." Mary couldn't breathe. She looked down at Ash, now curled in her lap, tail wrapped tightly around her nose. Tiny. Defenseless. She thought of her late husband, who had always told her, "You have a gift, Mare. You see the soul before the shape." She saw it now, clearer than ever. Ash wasn't just a wild animal. She was a bridge between worlds. A survivor. And Mary wasn't going to give her up without a fight. Ash's behavior and mysterious intelligence. By the end of the first week, Mary was sure of two things. Ash was no ordinary wildcat, and something far deeper than survival had drawn her to that cabin. It wasn't just her quiet nature or the way she slept against Jasper's warm fur. It was how she watched. Ash didn't behave like a feral animal. She didn't hide. She didn't cower in corners or lash out when Mary approached. Instead, she observed everything, her head tilting just slightly as if cataloging every sound, gesture, and facial expression. Mary had raised litters of foster kittens and once even cared for an orphaned fox cub, but this was different. There was intent in Ash's eyes. Each movement seemed chosen, as if she understood more than instinct could explain. It started subtly. Mary noticed that Ash would only eat when Mary sat nearby. Then she began to mimic Jasper, standing when he stood, curling when he curled, following behind him at a short but steady pace. On the third morning, Mary let Jasper out the front door for their usual walk. Ash trotted behind him. At first, Mary panicked, thinking the wildcat would bolt into the woods and vanish. But she didn't. She stopped right at the edge of the trees and looked back. When Mary called softly, "Come on, Ash," the kitten padded toward her. No training. No leash. No command. Just connection. That evening, Mary tested a theory. She clapped her hands twice. Ash turned. She repeated it the next day. Same result. Within 2 more days, Ash responded to 3 distinct hand gestures Mary used with Jasper. She came to the sound of Mary's voice. She used the litter box Mary had put out, just in case. She climbed onto the bed only after Mary patted the blanket. It was like watching an intelligence unfold, not learned, but revealed. One night, something terrifying confirmed Mary's suspicions. She had fallen asleep on the couch with a book in her lap. Jasper snoozed on the rug. Ash lay curled on the windowsill. At some point after midnight, Mary woke with a splitting headache and a strange, dizzy sensation. The air felt heavy. Wrong. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. Then came the noise, a loud scrape, claws against metal. Ash was on the fireplace vent, clawing and growling, her body puffed up like a defensive flare. Mary forced herself to crawl. The carbon monoxide detector, silent. Its batteries had died. In a panic, she opened the door, the cold air snapping her awake. She dragged Jasper out by his collar, coughing and gasping. Ash followed her immediately. Outside, beneath the moonlight, she collapsed to her knees, cradling Jasper while Ash sat beside them both, tail wrapped tightly around her own feet. By dawn, a fire crew had confirmed it. A faulty chimney seal had backed carbon monoxide into the house. If not for Ash, they all would have died. The fire chief looked at the kitten, then at Mary. "That a bobcat?" Mary nodded silently. "She's a damn hero," he muttered, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like that." Neither had Mary. The next day, she called Lisa at the wildlife center again. "I need to tell you what happened," Mary said, her voice shaking. Lisa listened quietly as Mary described Ash's alert, the mimicry, the response to training. "She's communicating. Choosing," Mary said. There was a long pause. "I don't know what to tell you," Lisa finally replied. "That's not typical." Mary didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over at Ash, now perched calmly on the windowsill again, eyes blinking slowly in the winter light. "I don't think she came to my door just to be rescued," Mary said softly. "I think she came to rescue me, too." The warning scratch. Snow melted slowly across the hills as February gave way to March, and with the thaw came trouble. Mary had hoped the silence meant the rumors had faded, that her neighbors had grown bored or distracted by other gossip. But peace, it seemed, was borrowed time. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a county wildlife officer named Daniel Marks pulled up to her property in a white government-issued SUV. He knocked once, firm, official. Mary opened the door with Ash perched calmly on her shoulder like a silent guardian. "Ms. Callahan?" the man asked. She nodded, heart already sinking. "I'm here following up on a wildlife complaint. Neighbor submitted photos of what appears to be a juvenile bobcat on your property." Mary didn't deny it. "She came to my doorstep during the snowstorm. She was starving and nearly frozen." Daniel sighed, taking out a small tablet and stylus. "I get it. I've read the notes from the Blue Ridge Center. But keeping a bobcat, even temporarily, without a wildlife permit, is a direct violation of state regulations." Mary crossed her arms. "She's not just a bobcat. She's bonded. She saved my life. She's not dangerous." "She may not be now," he said gently, "but she will be. Bobcats grow fast. Once her instincts shift, even by accident, she could hurt someone." "She won't," Mary said sharply. "She sleeps beside my dog. She's never hissed, scratched, or run." Daniel tapped a few more lines into his tablet. "I'm not unsympathetic. I've seen the rescue reports. I've even read the vet's notes. But I'm here because your neighbor pushed this up the chain. If the department gets another complaint, I'll be required to confiscate her." Mary's voice cracked. "What happens then?" "She'll be transferred to an out-of-county facility for behavioral testing. If she fails, she'll be deemed unreleasable." "And if she's unreleasable?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Mary felt her knees wobble, but she stood her ground. "I need time. A few more days. I'll file an appeal. I'll go public if I have to." Daniel hesitated. "Look. I'm giving you 48 hours. After that, it's out of my hands." He left without shaking her hand. Mary closed the door and leaned her forehead against it, heart pounding. Ash, sensing her tension, leapt onto the nearby chair, eyes alert, tail twitching. Jasper whined softly. Mary looked at both of them, her family, her miracle, and whispered, "They don't see what you are. But I do." That night, Ash didn't sleep. She paced the cabin restlessly, ears flicking, muscles tense. At 2:11 a.m., she scratched at the back door, then let out a sharp, guttural growl, something Mary had never heard from her before. She wasn't afraid. She was warning them. Something, or someone, was out there. And once again, Ash was the first to sense it. Mary jolted upright, heart pounding. Ash stood rigid at the back door, ears forward, tail low, emitting a low, urgent growl that vibrated in the silence. Jasper rose next, body stiff with alertness. Mary rubbed her eyes, then glanced at the clock. 2:11 a.m. She wrapped herself in a coat and slowly opened the door. Cold air rushed in, and so did Ash. The wildcat darted into the snow like a streak of silver, vanishing into the woods behind the cabin. Ash! Mary called in a loud whisper, panic rising. She grabbed her boots and flashlight, and Jasper followed at her heels. The forest was dark, but Ash's tiny tracks were fresh in the snow. Mary and Jasper followed the trail down the slope, through the birch trees, past the creek. The flashlight beam bounced with every step, illuminating only fragments, branches, shadows, breath turning to mist. Then she heard it. A moan. Not an animal. A human. She froze, heart hammering. Ahead, just beyond a fallen log, Ash stood motionless. At her paws lay a man, unconscious, face scraped, jacket torn. His skin was bluish, lips cracked, body curled tightly into himself. Mary dropped to her knees beside him. He was breathing, shallow, but alive. Ash sat beside the man as if guarding him. She hadn't left. She had led them. Mary quickly pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and called 911. As she gave their location to the dispatcher, she removed her coat and wrapped it around the man's shoulders. Jasper pressed close to share body heat, while Ash remained silent, watchful, her eyes never leaving the man's face. It took 18 minutes for the paramedics to reach them. By then, Mary had learned his name from the ID in his wallet, Brian Sullivan, 34, a hiker reported missing 2 nights earlier. He'd fallen while trying to find shelter, hit his head, and collapsed in the snow. The EMTs marveled at the situation. "You found him in the middle of the woods, at 2 a.m.? "I didn't," Mary said. "She did." She gestured to Ash. One of the responders blinked. "That's a bobcat." Mary nodded. "She came to my door in a storm. I guess it's her turn to bring someone else in from the cold." The story traveled fast. By morning, the local news was calling it a miracle. A bobcat saves lost hiker. Wild animal leads woman to unconscious man. Hero cat of Blue Ridge. But for Mary, it wasn't about headlines. It was about Ash, curled in her lap again that night, exhausted but safe. It was about knowing, deep in her bones, that this creature wasn't here by accident. And now, maybe others would believe it too. By sunrise, Mary's quiet life had become front-page news. A local journalist picked up the emergency dispatch report and wrote a blog post titled, "Wildcat Saves Hiker in North Carolina Woods." Within hours, regional news stations picked it up, followed by national headlines. Camera crews began showing up at the edge of Mary's property, bundled in scarves and carrying tripods. Some wanted a statement. Others wanted footage of the bobcat hero. Mary gave a single, quiet interview to a local wildlife magazine. She sat on her porch, with Jasper at her feet and Ash curled in her lap, ears twitching as if listening to every word. "She came to me in a storm," Mary told the reporter. "She had no reason to trust me, but she did. And when someone else needed help, she trusted me enough to lead me to him." Photos of Ash sitting beside Jasper went viral. People were stunned by how calm she looked, how comfortable she was in a human home. Tweets flooded in. "That bobcat is better trained than my dog. This wildcat has more emotional intelligence than most people I know. Proof that some animals choose us for a reason." But the attention brought scrutiny too. The North Carolina Wildlife Commission released a public statement reminding residents that keeping wild animals as pets was prohibited. Reporters reached out to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where Lisa, the same staffer Mary had spoken with, found herself in an unexpected spotlight. When asked about Ash's behavior, Lisa gave a carefully worded reply. "We've reviewed her case and spoken directly with Ms. Callahan. While this is still a wild animal, what we're seeing is unusual. There's a clear emotional bond, and her behavior suggests a level of socialization rarely observed in bobcats this young." The term emotionally bonded sparked debate. Some wildlife biologists weighed in, calling for immediate removal and rehabilitation. Others argued Ash represented a new kind of case, an edge between wild and tame. Mary filed an official appeal through her attorney, requesting a special wildlife ambassador designation, which, if approved, would allow Ash to remain under Mary's care as part of a research and education program. She also submitted testimonials from Dr. Callie, from the EMTs who witnessed Ash at the rescue, and even from Officer Daniel Marks, the same officer who had warned her days earlier. "I've worked in this field for over a decade," Daniel wrote. "I've never seen a wild animal behave this way, not with this level of control, awareness, and choice." The application was submitted. Now all Mary could do was wait. Each morning, she sat with Ash by the fire. Each night, she watched the stars, wondering what fate would decide. But deep down, beneath the fear and uncertainty, one thing remained clear. Ash had saved a life, and changed the way people saw what was possible between human and wild. A wildcat's second chance. 2 weeks after the appeal was submitted, Mary received a certified letter bearing the seal of the North Carolina Wildlife Commission. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she made tea, sat by the fireplace, and placed the envelope on the table like it was something alive. Jasper lay at her feet. Ash, now stronger and more graceful, rested on the windowsill, tail twitching lazily. Finally, with a steadying breath, Mary tore open the letter. She scanned the first few lines and gasped softly. "Application approved. Conditional wildlife ambassador status granted." Tears filled her eyes as she read the rest. Ash would remain with Mary under a formal wildlife educational partnership program, supported by a local university and monitored by wildlife experts. The state would provide oversight, training resources, and occasional check-ins, but Ash would stay home. Mary dropped the letter into her lap and let the relief wash over her. Ash turned from the window and leapt lightly into Mary's lap, curling her body into the exact spot where the paper had fallen. As if she knew. And maybe she did. The months that followed transformed Mary's once solitary cabin into something unexpected. Researchers and students came by appointment, observing Ash's behavior and interactions with both humans and Jasper. A documentary crew filmed a short feature titled Ash, Between Two Worlds, which aired on public television and was later streamed by millions. Local schools invited Mary to speak about wildlife compassion and the importance of trust between species. She never called herself an expert. She simply told their story. "Ash isn't a pet," she would explain gently to curious children. "She's a partner. She's wild, but she chose to trust. And that trust is a gift." Mary's art also began to change. Her once lonely landscapes became filled with motion, wolves running through snow, lynxes resting under trees, wild things in quiet communion with the world around them. One painting of Ash and Jasper sleeping side by side beneath moonlight was featured in a National Gallery exhibit called The Heart of the Wild. And every night, after the guests were gone and the cameras packed away, Mary would return to her porch, cup of tea in hand. Jasper would lie beside her. Ash would leap silently onto the railing and stretch, her silhouette framed against the stars. Sometimes, Mary still marveled at how a storm had brought her more than survival. It had brought her purpose, connection, and a reminder that nature wasn't always meant to be feared, or fixed. Sometimes, it just wanted to be understood. As the seasons turned, Mary's cabin became known not as the home of a reclusive artist, but as a sanctuary, where the line between wild and human had blurred, not by force, but by trust. And as long as Ash lay beside her, breathing softly in rhythm with the wind, Mary knew she would never be alone again. The bond that broke all rules. Autumn came early to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Golden leaves fell in spirals outside Mary's cabin as the first frost kissed the grass in silver. Inside, everything looked the same wood-burning stove, the same scratched floorboards, the same soft snore of Jasper sleeping by the hearth. But everything had changed. Mary sat by the window with a steaming mug of tea, watching Ash curled up in a patch of sunlight. She had grown. No longer a fragile kitten, Ash was now a sleek, muscular adolescent, her fur a swirl of smoke and shadows, her eyes deeper and wiser than any creature Mary had ever known. And yet, she still came when Mary called. She still rested her head on Jasper's back. She still curled beside Mary's legs during the long, quiet evenings. The world had moved on from their story. The headlines faded. The film crews stopped calling. But Mary didn't mind. In fact, she was grateful. Because beyond the attention, beyond the noise, lay the real gift, a second chance, not just for Ash, but for herself. Mary thought of the years after her husband's death. The silence. The long winters that felt endless. The ache that had settled deep inside her, growing roots. She had tried to fill it with paint, with books, with long walks through empty woods. But grief had a way of sitting beside you, even when no one else would. Until Ash arrived. That night still played in her mind like a quiet dream, the scratching at the door, the look in those eyes, the weight of something wild and terrified against her chest. It hadn't been coincidence. It had been calling. A test, perhaps. Or maybe a gift. Mary sipped her tea and smiled. People had questioned her. Had called her foolish, reckless, emotional. But those people had never seen what she had seen. They hadn't watched a wild creature press her body against a dying man to keep him warm. They hadn't seen a bobcat mimic a dog's kindness, or warn a human of invisible danger. They hadn't stood on a porch as the sun rose and felt, truly felt, what it meant to be trusted by something untamed. Ash stirred, stretching her long legs and blinking in the warm light. She leapt up onto the windowsill and gazed out toward the woods. Mary followed her gaze. The trees swayed gently, golden and red, the forest preparing for sleep. Mary reached out and touched Ash's back. The wildcat didn't flinch. Didn't move. She just leaned in, eyes soft. And in that moment, Mary didn't see an animal. She saw grace. Resilience. Hope. And a bond stronger than fear, stronger than rules. A bond born of snow, silence, and second chances. The first snow of winter fell quietly that evening. It wasn't a storm, just a gentle cascade of white that blanketed the trees, rooftops, and winding trails around Mary's cabin. The world hushed itself in reverence, as if nature had paused to listen. Inside, Mary lit a single lantern, its amber glow dancing along the log walls. Jasper lay by the fire, his muzzle now more gray than gold, but his tail thumped softly with peace. Ash sat at the far edge of the room, perched on the armrest of Mary's favorite reading chair. She stared at the door. Unmoving. Alert. As if remembering. Mary stepped beside her, running a hand gently down her back. "You remember that night too, don't you?" she whispered. Ash gave a slow blink. Mary walked to the door and opened it. The cold rushed in, sharp and pure. Ash stepped forward and sniffed the wind. She didn't bolt. She didn't flee. She simply looked back at Mary, her eyes glowing in the moonlight, as if to say, "I could go. But I choose to stay." That was the miracle. Not that Ash had been rescued. But that she had remained. She had been given every opportunity to return to the wild, to slip silently into the woods she was born to roam. But she never did. She came back every time, every single time. By choice. That was the rule she had broken. And the one Mary had, in her own way, broken too. For years, Mary had lived under the illusion that grief meant closing the world out. That healing came from solitude. But Ash had shown her that healing sometimes arrived in claws and silence, in sharp eyes and unexpected companionship. Mary knelt on the porch and held her hand out. Ash padded forward, stepping into her palm. She pressed her face gently against Mary's chest, just as she had on that first night. The snow thickened around them, but neither moved. Time didn't matter here. Rules didn't matter here. Only trust. Only love. Only the moment. In the distance, an owl hooted. Ash's ears twitched. Then she turned, leapt onto the porch railing, and perched like a sentinel, eyes scanning the white woods beyond. Mary stood behind her, watching the forest too. And for a long while, they stood there together, two souls from different worlds, side by side in the stillness. Not tamed. Not owned. Not owed. Just together. As the snow continued to fall, Mary whispered to the wind, "You were never just a wildcat. You were what brought me back." And in the hush of that winter night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, Ash blinked once, slow and certain. A silent answer. A forever promise. Sometimes, the most powerful bonds aren't born from words, but from instinct, trust, and quiet moments of shared understanding. Ash, a wild bobcat, reminded us that love doesn't always arrive in familiar forms. It may come in silence. In wild eyes. In a storm. And when it does, we must choose whether to turn it away, or open the door. In life, we often build walls to protect ourselves, after loss, pain, or fear. But sometimes, healing begins the moment we take a risk to trust again. Mary didn't just rescue Ash. Ash rescued Mary too. And perhaps that's what life is all about, being brave enough to answer the quiet knocks when they come. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe that every animal has a voice, and every story, a heartbeat. So here's our challenge for you. The next time something unexpected scratches at the edge of your comfort zone, whether it's a moment, a stranger, or a second chance, will you close the door? Or will you step into the snow? That's a decision only you can make. But remember, some of the most unforgettable journeys begin with a quiet, persistent scratch. We'll be here, ready to share the next paw print in the story.